Okay, so I'm going to teach you the basics of how to make an overlay. Or at least some basics. There's no hard and fast rules really. Just some tips. So first off, we have three things that make up an overlay in general. The subject, the foreground, and the background. The subject is essentially what is the main focus of a particular scene, and thus the overlay is designed to bring focus to it. You can think of the subject as either media or the content creator. So in case of media, you've got things like gameplay, videos, crafting, like when you're doing hand cams and stuff. All that sort of stuff falls into the general sense of media. Whereas the creator is really like when you're just in a chatting scene and you have the creator in front of you, either in the VTuber form like myself, or in a dirty flesh suit. You get what I mean. In these two cases, subject is kind of different. Media is the one that we will focus on, since your just chatting sort of scenes are able to break a lot of these conventions, since the character or person that's the focus of the screen isn't typically going to take up all of the screen real estate. So you can generally overlap a lot more with the subject. So, how much space on the screen does the media need? You can go 100%, and when you go 100%, you have no background. But it does mean that your foreground elements are going to have a lot of overlap. My recommendation? Have around from 95% of your screen real estate is probably your upper limit, and probably aiming for around 85%, maybe a bit smaller down to probably 75% would be your lower end of things, as your sort of Goldilocks zone. Going any smaller than 60% is going to be problematic. As you can see with the reference here, there's not a lot of actual visual real estate, particularly for high detail. And so that's kind of where the problem with media comes in, or your subject. The smaller it is, the less detail you have on it. The larger it is, the less real estate you have available for foreground, which is what we're going to move on to now. For foreground, I would say aim for a 30% region as your limiter. Aim for. You don't need to fill this area in entirely. Most of your foreground elements are either semi-transparent, meaning you can see stuff behind them, or they're semi-permanent. They're not there all the time. Depending on what different elements you need in the foreground, or for what scene, you may have more or less. But you can typically think of this as the character or camera. I have given an example here, which is a 500 by 500 pixel box. Next you have chat. I have two options here for visible representation. The one in the top right hand corner is the standard 300 by 600 for chat, and the one in the bottom left here is a 900 by 200, so 900 wide, 200 high. This is the other alternative. These are the two typical chat regions. As you may notice, there's not a lot of room on the screen with them there. So here is an example of an 80% media. You can see that it fits in between them quite perfectly, and it doesn't hit the edge. So you can see kind of where I'm getting at with this sort of thing. Generally, you would choose one of those two zones for chat, and the rest of it is just extra real estate. If you want to have more room for a model, I would say going with the bottom left option, and you can pull your model up higher. If, however, you want room for, say, Foogies, which is another foreground element, these are the little chat icons that respond in Discord, I'd say probably having the chat in the top right works better for that scenario, as it means that you've got plenty of space for the Foogies to pop in. Note that either or is perfectly fine, and you can set up scenes with both alternatives. Next, of course, are other foreground elements, such as alerts, which pop up over the screen. You generally don't want to put them over the top of chat, so I would suggest that if you have chat in the top right, you can put them in the bottom left or in the top left. If you are having chat in the bottom left, top left is probably your only region that you're going to use. So generally, top left is one of the better places to put it. If for some reason you decide that you want your chat on the left-hand side of the screen, then just flip the logic and put your alerts in the top right. Other than alerts, the other two things that you will commonly see for overlays, particularly when it comes to streaming, are labels, which just highlight individuals who have donated, subbed, or followed, or having a goal bar, be it follows or subs or donations. There are various different types. These are your other foreground elements. As far as I see, most people have been tending away from labels since it's becoming more common to not put people's names out when they do donations, subs, and in particular follows. As for the other sub-goals, depending on how you do them, you will end up with different real estate. For example, I, like a number of people, use a bar graph sort of thing, a bar that fills up progressively. It's a nice narrow thing which you can fit into any gaps that you have, but the other option, which some people do, is a sort of circle which slowly fills upwards. Both of these options are fine, but definitely figure out how you're going to work the design. So now that we've covered those two options, our last thing to cover, of course, with foreground elements is any weird thing that you like to pop up over the screen. A lot of people will have things like Tangerine, I think it is, where it just has these little like pop-up alerts that people can pay for, or some people have inbuilt pop-ups and stuff. Do make sure that you test these for your overlay and consider how they will interrupt the flow of media. In some cases, you're okay with this. You don't care about converting the video later into, say, a highlight or something, and just care for it as a VOD. But if you plan to make VODs out of it, these sort of pop-ups can cause problems, particularly if you're not turning them on and off. There are ways around this, such as designing them specifically to only appear up in certain areas, but to each their own. These are a type of foreground element, though, and it was worth putting them here. The last area, of course, to talk about is the background. The background sits behind everything else, technically. Usually when you design a background, you put it actually in front of the media, so that if you have any like weird trimmings or stuff in standardized sizes and things, it doesn't bleed over it. But the background is generally cut to fit the media into it and sits behind everything else. Backgrounds, for the most part, are pretty much static images. Some people like to do animations on them. My recommendation is keep the animation minimal and an easy repeating loop. The reason for this is quite simple. The more complex the loop is, the harder it is to make clean cuts when editing. I've learnt this from my own experience, but it can be very weird when you make a cut and your background animation suddenly jumps about. A lot of people like to have animation on scenes for doing this sort of thing, and honestly, my recommendation is have your animation for chatting scenes. Stuff where it doesn't matter too much if things jump around, like, you know, the model suddenly moving around, or some background element in the loop just suddenly jumps. because those sort of cuts are to try and keep consistency of the conversation, so it doesn't matter too much about what's going on in the background. But when it's gameplay, and you have a large animation that suddenly jumps about, like a spinning gear, for example, which is my issue, it can be jarring, particularly if you're looking and then all of a sudden you notice something just tweak in the corner of your view, like that. So yeah, my recommendation is generally for like media scenes, don't have minimal animation, if possible none at all. Save it for your chatting, and of course your intros and outros. Now, of course, some of you may be like, oh, well, what's an example of maybe a more complicated scene or an overlay that you've done that at least adheres to some of this logic? Well, let me just change scenes for a second. I have this scene over here. As you can see, we've got media, we've got a chat, which is actually smaller than the chat recommendation that I made, and a bar up the top. I haven't got the alerts going. I don't have any Fugies on here or anything, but you can see everything going on the scene. The window in the middle, I think, is actually 50%, but that's fine. It's not the focus of the scene. The focus, of course, is more me. Also, there's more me over there, but don't worry about that. That was a bit of fun. But as you can see, the importance of a scene in its overall, the background is more there to give it a sense of character of who you are. But you don't want to go overboard, and as some of you may notice is a problem for me, the coloration that I use for my model is too similar to some of the background elements, and so I blend in. I know some VTuber models have a sort of outlining that they use, and that's quite popular, but I would still recommend, if you are designing your VTuber model and your backgrounds, that you make sure you are not too similar in color or tone. Particularly for people who suffer from some sort of color blindness. You will begin to fade into the background. But that is my little suggestion there. Let's get back to the main scene. Yeah, so that is the kind of the be-all and end-all of things here. Let me center myself again. Overlays in general should use similar backgrounds, so thinking about how you're going to cut all your different scenes is important. I, for myself, have a generic background, and I cut all the different bits out of it so that I could see what all my different overlays looked like, where my blank space was, where my screens were going to be, and everything. And I adjust it for that so that it looks okay. But everyone's going to design overlays differently, and there are some scenes that will, particularly chatting ones, that generally break a lot of the conventions that I'm trying to put it out there to help people. I will say that the 85 to 75% for media is a very good thing to recommend. Another thing for testing. Test while typing messages in chat, screenshot those, then send the screenshot to your phone and see how big the text is on there. That is an easy way to tell how your fonts will read when on mobile devices, instead of trying to test streaming it. Take screenshots. OBS does allow you to take screenshots. If I remember correctly, it is right-click and screenshot preview, and it'll go right to where your recording folder is. Do this and do it often, because it allows you to test different things for visibility. Sending them to your phone or putting them onto a device that is smaller, like a tablet, allows you to see readability of things. Because you've got to remember, you're not just having people looking on like a full screen monitor. Some people will watch your content on a phone, particularly when you do things like shorts or upload stuff to YouTube. I know I've got a lot of people who watch my stuff on phones from YouTube, so I have to consider font size. So at the end of the day, make sure that things are easily visible. Think about how things will overlap and what things get covered. And probably my biggest recommendation, keep an area around your media that it doesn't have overlaps. This was one thing that has been a real pain for me, because I take thumbnails of the gameplay. I had one overlay that has this huge chat thing that creeps into it with a really noticeable purple bar, and it makes it horrible to get screenshots of to make a nice thumbnail. Now, some people would say, you know, I'll just do custom ones, art and everything. Sometimes you just need a simple screenshot for a thumbnail, particularly if you were just doing like lots of videos and lots of thumbnails. But yeah, that's probably my last recommendation for anyone trying to make their own overlays. Other thing, if you are commissioning an overlay from anyone, ask for the pixel measurements of any of your windows for media. So, for example, if you have a window cutout for your gameplay to go under, get the aspect ratio for it. Is it like 1000 by 600? Because then you can correctly measure your window to fit into that space. And if you have them like do like a chat window or anything else, ask them to separate them into different image layers, so that for any reason, if you need to take chat off the screen to do like a after recording, or you decide, I don't really want this on the overlay anymore, like they gave you labels, or you have like a sub bar and you don't really need it anymore or don't want it, if you have them in separate layers, you can remove them. That is probably one of the biggest things I recommend, because as the one that I showed earlier, the chat is separate, the sub bar is separate, so if I ever want to remove them for any reason, I can. That's probably my last little recommendation. Yeah. If any of this was helpful, you know, just giving a like or a comment on the video would really help me just know, because I don't normally do graphic design advice. But I am a graphic designer. That's probably a little out there. I'm actually a qualified graphic designer, I'm qualified in multimedia, and I'm technically a programmer. I have way too many pieces of paper. So yeah, a like on the video would be great. I won't ask for anything else other than that in a comment, if this was helpful or if you want any other tips and things. And yeah, I'm gonna go edit this now and hope I make something watchable. And yet I took a course on video editing.